Today we talk about how could PGT be so wrong?
I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.
Today we're talking about a topic that causes a lot of confusion and sometimes unnecessary fear. Preimplantation Genetic Testing for Aneuploidy, also known as PGT-A. Specifically, why it seems like some embryos labeled as abnormal have gone on to have healthy babies. You may have seen the headlines or heard stories claiming that PGT-A was so wrong, that these so-called abnormal embryos led to live births. So what gives? Was PGT-A actually wrong? Or was the data just misunderstood? Well, let's dive in this episode and learn a little bit more about this. To truly understand this podcast, we're going to have to define some terms. An aneuploid embryo has the wrong number of chromosomes in all of its cells. And these are almost always incompatible with a healthy pregnancy. A mosaic embryo, on the other hand, has a mix. Some normal, some abnormal cells. Think of it like baking a batch of cookies. You mix everything together, but if a few pockets have too much salt or not enough sugar, some bites will taste great while others might be slightly off. The ingredients are all there, but not evenly distributed. That's mosaicism. Some cells are normal, others aren't. All depending on how things were mixed in the early stages of development. Now I'm simplifying this a bit because true mosaicism can be everywhere where all the cells in the human body can have mosaic DNA where some of the DNA is normal and some of the DNA is abnormal, like mosaic turners. There are other situations where you can have mosaic where the placenta has one type of DNA and then in the embryo it's different. The point is when you look at a mosaic embryo, you almost have to think of it having three states. The first state would be a completely normal embryo. But when they took the biopsy, they got some abnormal cells, and so it looks like the embryo is mosaic. The other state would be if the embryo is abnormal, and when they took the biopsy, they got some normal cells, and now the embryo looks mosaic. And then the third state would be a truly mosaic embryo, where every cell in the embryo has the mosaic DNA. Now, over the years, PGT has evolved. In the very beginning, we used what's called FISH, fluorescent in situ hybridization. And that is not really used anymore because basically what they would do is you would take a probe that would then go to the chromosomes and attach, and then it would light up with a certain color and would let you know if something is there or is not. That methodology cannot detect mosaicism. After that came aCGH, which stands for Array Comparative Genomic Hybridization. Much better than FISH, but had a low sensitivity to detect mosaicism, especially any type of mosaicism that's under 40%. So a lot of things were called abnormal, meaning aneuploid, even though it might have mosaicism. Part of the issue with this method is it could not quantify the portion of abnormal cells. So it was more of like it's either there or not there type of readout. SNP arrays that came around were a little bit better than aCGH at detecting mosaicism, but they still struggled with quantifying the percentage of abnormal cells. This means that some embryos were called abnormal, meaning aneuploid, when in reality they could have been normal. Then came NGS, Next Generation Sequencing. This is now the gold standard for mosaicism. It can detect and quantify the mosaicism down to about 20 to 30%. There are times it can even be lower with certain platforms. Now labs take that gradient and say, okay, if it's under 20% abnormal, then they're going to call it euploid. If it's 20 to 40% abnormal, they call it low-level mosaic, 40 to 80% high-level mosaic, and if over 80% of the cells show aneuploidy, then they call it aneuploid. But the question is, how did it get to this state? When did someone start calling them mosaic when before it was either euploid or aneuploid? Well, before 2015, everything just got lumped into aneuploid. In 2015, there were some reports that some embryos labeled as aneuploid by PGT-A still led to healthy births. That sounds amazing, right? But when those embryos were actually analyzed closely, What they found is they were actually mosaic embryos and not truly aneuploid. The problem wasn't the test. It was that the mosaicism wasn't fully recognized and was reported at that time as being aneuploid, even though it was incorrect. Now, what you will hear is people will say, oh yes, your abnormal embryos will lead to live births. But this was based on studies in the past that looked at embryos that were lumped into aneuploid, even though they weren't aneuploid. They were mosaic. So now we fast forward to today, and now we have much better data, especially from large blinded studies. One of the most striking studies looked at over 100 embryos labeled as truly aneuploid using modern next-day generation sequencing, found that not one of them led to a live birth. Now, some I implanted and maybe even started to go into a heartbeat or something like that, but then eventually it failed. It had 0% sustained success. Now, this study was really important because what it did is they tested all of the embryos with PGT-A, but they didn't look at the results. And then they went and they transferred this into patients and then later unblinded the results to find out which embryos were euploid, which ones were aneuploid, which ones were mosaic, and what happened. And in that study, none of them that were aneuploid led to a live birth. Now, if you compare that to mosaic embryos, which depending on the degree of the mosaicism, some did leave the live births 30 to 50% of the time. So what this tells us is the misclassified embryos as aneuploid instead of mosaic is what led to in the past abnormal embryos becoming live births. Now, it's important to understand, it's not that they were wrong, it's just at that time we didn't realize this. Methods like aCGH and SNP arrays didn't have the resolution to detect mosaicism very well. So unfortunately, these were called abnormal, being aneuploid, and were not transferred. When next-gen sequencing came around, it changed the game. It can detect these subtle shifts and give a much more accurate picture so we can determine if the embryo might just have a couple abnormal cells in it versus the whole embryo being abnormal. And it's not stopping there. Matter of fact, Cooper Genomics has gone even further recently. They now preserve the original DNA rather than just making copies of the DNA. So when you get the sample, you have to amplify it with whole genome amplification. But you keep making copies of copies. And so now they have a technique that actually uses the original DNA, which then lowers the noise in the data so you can get better resolution. They also now are integrating SNPs into the analysis, which then allows them to look at other things such as copy number, so they can rule out conditions like triploidy, and to detect uniparental disomy. This is when both copies of the DNA came from the same parent. So it looks like both came from one from the mom and one from the dad, but in this situation, it's from the same parent. Now, it's important to understand that adding the SNPs doesn't really directly improve the mosaicism detection, but it does help rule out those other conditions. The point is, we haven't stopped looking and we're always trying to get better. So here's the kicker. Even with next-gen sequencing, we can't reliably detect mosaicism below about 20%. And the question is, why? Well, we're only sampling a few cells, 5 to 10 cells at most. An embryo has hundreds of cells. So if you biopsy 5 cells and 1 cell is abnormal, that's only 20%. And this is the problem. We expect it to be uniform throughout, but it's not. We wish it was reflective of the whole embryo, but we know it can't always be. It would be like taking one bite of a great taco, and you think that's going to represent the whole taco, but on that bite, they messed up. Like put too much sour cream and guac on one side, barely any meat, and you're like, this is disgusting. But what you don't know is the rest of that taco is amazing. Unfortunately, it wasn't distributed, and your biopsy was only a small portion of the entire taco. So the sampling of a few cells like that is not reflective of the whole picture. Add to that the noise that's introduced by DNA amplification. Noise is when you have all this data, it's all over the place, and you have to eventually smooth it out. If there are too many outliers in the data, then you can't utilize the data. But there are some outliers, and usually what happens is those are kind of thrown out. But if it becomes too noisy, you can't distinguish the actual DNA from the noise. Think of it as technical background noise. So the 20% is kind of the limit currently that people believe in because they feel that has a good representation of not tossing too many embryos, but not overcalling as well. And this brings us to one of the biggest points. patient fear. What if we're discarding healthy embryos because of PGT-A? Well, here's the reassuring truth. The likelihood of discarding a truly healthy embryo labeled as aneuploidy is extremely low. Modern PGT-A is very accurate. If your embryo is labeled as aneuploid by NGS and confirmed not to be mosaic, the chance of resulting in a healthy baby are near zero. There are multiple prospective studies that confirm this now. So how could they be so wrong in the past? Because there were some early misclassifications. But now that we understand mosaicism, the technology and reporting have caught up. Your clinic should be differentiating between mosaic, segmental, and full aneuploidy. And if they are, you can feel pretty reassured that the likelihood of discarding a truly healthy embryo is near zero. This doesn't mean things may not get better. We may learn things even later. But the one part we do know is when you look at blinded testing, where they didn't know whether the embryo was normal or not, they did not see live births with the truly full aneuploidy embryos. So back to the main question. How could PGT be so wrong? The answer is, it wasn't. The test wasn't flawed, the interpretation was. When we saw aneuploid labeled embryos led to live births, we thought we had proof that PGT was wrong. But what we really had were mosaic embryos hiding in plain sight. We thought they were abnormal, leading to live births, but they were never abnormal to begin with. Like all tools, PGT-A is powerful, but it needs to be used and understood properly. Now that we know how to interpret mosaicism, we're better than ever identifying embryos that have a true shot at becoming your healthy baby. So trust the process, but always ask questions. Make sure your clinic is using the most up-to-date methods and language when it comes to categorizing embryos. And the reason for that is if they're not categorizing the embryos correctly, then yes, it is possible that you are throwing away embryos that could lead to a live birth if they're being called aneuploid and they're actually mosaic embryos. Maybe you're like a lot of people who have been wondering for some time, am I throwing away normal embryos? Maybe you've been in those forums where people say, oh, I've heard of people getting pregnant with aneuploid embryos. But now you know you don't have to be as fearful. Because what the studies show is that if you look at mosaicism and you're putting back full aneuploid embryos, it's not going to lead to a live birth. Sure, there might be one case every once in a blue moon that may happen, but that is the outlier and that is the rarity. When I say rarity, I mean saying almost zero. If you hear someone getting pregnant with an abnormal embryo, there's a good chance it wasn't abnormal, but that was classified wrong. And you should feel confident that you're not throwing away healthy embryos as long as your clinic is classifying both euploid, aneuploid, and mosaic embryos. I think this is a really important topic, and I really hope you pass this along to other people. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about how PGT can be wrong, and I agree that there might be the appearance of it being wrong, but as you heard in this podcast, it's not that PGT was wrong, it's how it was interpreted. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. And as I always say, if you like the show, give us a 5-star review on your favorite medium, but most of all, keep coming back. I look forward to talking to you again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.